Hey, Craig, was curious since I understand that you're an atheist. I was wondering for you what the most compelling reason to believe in God is and why you decided that you don't believe in God.
Okay. Yeah. I, my father is an Episcopal minister, so I was raised in a religious family. Now, Episcopalians are kind of the hippies of Christianity. They don't take it too seriously. And my father was a very loving man. I had a lovely upbringing. He was not a Bible thumper, and he didn't make me, go to church. I went voluntarily to church until I was about 12 for two reasons. There were pretty girls there with dresses, and I was insanely attracted to girls for, starting in about first grade. So I don't know. I think I was a weird kid. Anyway, pretty girls were there in pretty dresses, and I was like, that's where I'm going. So I was there for that, and then I also pretended to sing in the choir, and the pretense was an agreement with the choir master because my voice was so bad. And I loved the music. I loved the choral music, so I loved being in the choir. But when I sang, it like ruined everything. So I would just mouth the words, and I had a wink, wink with the choir master. So that's why I went to church. When I turned, I think I was around 12 when I really started to realize that the whole thing that that I would never took very seriously anyway, but that it was literal just nonsense. There was no reason to believe in God. There was no evidence for God. It was just a silly story, and I didn't wasn't getting any value of it. So I declared, sort of my atheism at about 12 years old. However, the thing it's easy to make that decision because there's just no evidence for God, and the whole idea, if you start to really think about it, it's just kind of silly. um, what I didn't repudiate is altruism, the moral code that comes with religion. I had swallowed that hook, line, and sinker, and that stuck with me, frankly, until I read Ayn Rand and got my head around the truth and the value of rational egoism and what that's all about. So that was my long, hard climb out of a bad place, is just repudiating altruism and learning that egoism is true, and that altruism there's no more supporting altruism than there is supporting the existence of God. Both of them are supported by literally nothing. So that was the more difficult thing for me. Um, you had another part in this question. I was wondering, oh, what do I think is the most compelling reason to believe in God? You know, I know this sounds like a cop out because you should be able to say, oh, look, here's the strong man, the steel man argument for my opponents. And I should be able to say that. But I do not, when you look into the arguments for God, they just peter out one after the other within the frame of a few questions. It will take a couple of examples. So, take the argument that, well, God must exist because otherwise, who created the universe? So the argument from creation. Well, why do we have to assume anyone created the universe to begin with? Why can't we just assume that the universe is eternal? It's just always been. A. And B, if you take the premise that if something exists, it has to have been created, then if God exists, he has to have been created. And of course, religionists go, no, 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 no. We got to stop somewhere. And this is just called special pleading. It's just a logical fallacy. So there's that. And then if you go to something like, what is the ontological argument? If you imagine the most perfect being of all, and then imagine him not existing, and then imagine him existing, which one is better? Which one is more perfect? And this is like St. Anselm's silly argument. And this argument is so stupid because better or perfect, any evaluative term like that, presupposes an answer to the question, better for what purpose and by what standard? Perfect for what purpose and by what standard? Um, and unless you can answer those questions, you're using the words better and perfect as floating abstractions. You don't know what they mean. And so these terms just don't carry any, the arguments don't carry any water. They just don't. And in my view, pretty much every argument for God comes down to either an arbitrary assertion. They're just God exists, and you can't prove he doesn't. And then that you can't prove he doesn't is an instance of what's called the argument from ignorance. It's like, you're ignorant about the way to prove that God doesn't exist, and I'm going to use your ignorance as evidence that he does exist, right? So this is the, or they'll say, how did life come into existence? If you can't say how life came into existence, that is, if you're ignorant of this explanation, then I'm going to use that ignorance as evidence for the existence of God, right? But ignorance is not evidence. They're different things. That's why we have two different concepts for these things. And so that's an instance, and you'll find this all over the place when you're arguing with religionists. They treat your ignorance about something as evidence for God. So just bear that one in mind. And then the other one is stolen concepts, which is a fallacy identified by Ayn Rand, where people say things like, well, if God doesn't exist, then where are we going to get the laws of identity and causality, right? And this is called the transcendental argument for God, the idea that if the laws of logic hold, somebody must have made them, there must be a lawmaker who made these things. But as soon as someone says the question, well, how or why or anything like that, he is presupposing the primacy of existence and a reality to which we're going to refer to answer the questions that we have about things. That's the end of the road. That's why we have things like the law of identity and the law of causality and the other laws of logic. So in my view, those three arguments, arbitrary assertions, the appeal to ignorance, and stolen concepts, and the stolen concept there is they're using concepts like, why and how, and can you, explain. All of those words are stolen concepts if the person is denying the primacy of existence, the primacy of a solid reality in which things are what they are, act in accordance with their natures, and we can recourse to that reality in order to understand it and explain things. And if they're going to say, no, that can't be the end of the line, then they're using all of these concepts which depend on that foundation, while simultaneously denying that that is the foundation. And that's why it's called a stolen concept. So I just don't think there are any good arguments for God, certainly not any longer. I think if you were alive, back in Thomas Aquinas's time, and certainly if you were alive way back when Aristotle thought that, well, because motion exists in the universe, there must be a first cause of the first motion. And that was sort of his thinking on that. But even that, we don't need a first cause of a first motion if we recognize that things are what they are and they act in accordance with their identities. And then the universe is eternal. There have always been things. They've always had natures and identities, and they've always acted in accordance with those natures and identities. There's no reason to believe otherwise. And there's a world of reason to believe that that's the way things have always been, because we don't have any evidence to the contrary. And when you look around, that's just the way things are. So for more on this kind of stuff, for anyone who's listening, and this may all sound kind of new, objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, is full of answers to these kinds of things. Her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, gets into a lot of this. Her book, Philosophy Who Needs It, gets into a lot of it. And then a book by her colleague, Leonard Peikoff, that's titled Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is really a systematic presentation of her philosophy, and it's very good. And he gets into the nuts and bolts of these kinds of things, the primacy of existence, and why arguments for God are just a violation of this one principle that you just can't get around. He gets into stolen concepts, and I don't think he mentions the argument from ignorance in there, but he definitely gets into what an arbitrary assertion is, So I recommend looking there for more on that. But bottom line, yeah, I don't think there are good, compelling reasons to believe in God. I've never heard one. So.